For hundreds of years, they lay in darkness. Their creators had been destroyed, but their spirit could not be killed. Gods had built them, some said. Others insisted they had built themselves. Yet most believed that powerful spirits protected the vast stone city deep in the Cambodian jungle. And woe would come to whomever disturbed its slumber. Centuries apart, two men would fall under Angkor's spell. One was a naturalist, lured by tales of exotic creatures and a fabulous lost city. The other was a diplomat, sent to demand tribute from a civilization far richer than he'd ever imagined. Their epic tales would inflame the world's curiosity and light a fire in the darkness of Cambodia's lost world.
The mystery of Angkor is what is not known. We don't know much about the people.
Think about it, with people, when it was filled with worshipers, the community were out in the fields growing rice. What was it like when it was active and alive?
So it's extraordinary. The mystery is basically, what's this thing? Why is it so big? Why is it glittering in the sun like this? What's it for?
It's mysterious. You feel that something went on here that's not going on there today, but something went on there that is different from much of the rest of the world.
In Southeast Asia, an abandoned city sprawls magnificently across the heart of Cambodia. Its hundreds of monuments contain more stone than the Egyptian pyramids and cover more ground than modern Paris. This is Angkor, the capital of an empire that once controlled most of Southeast Asia. They were called the Khmer, and more than 500 years ago, they vanished. To the outside world, the city existed only in obscure travelers' tales, until a Frenchman in the 19th century brought Angkor to light. He was a naturalist, searching for unknown species of plants and animals. Almost by accident, he uncovered one of mankind's greatest creations. In the 1850s, Frenchman Henri Mouot seemed to be well on his way to becoming the world's first wildlife photographer. A naturalist and a portrait painter, Mouot dabbled in the new devilish art of photography. Mouot was a born roamer. By age 30, he'd crisscrossed Europe and Russia. But it was the tales of those who ventured further abroad that would lure him to the jungles of Cambodia.
A book had just been published in 1857 about the area of Southeast Asia. In a sense, it was the focus that drew him. The first Europeans to explore Africa and Asia were usually marginal people in their own societies. They didn't quite fit in, and so they went to these other places and explored them. But in the process of exploring them, they opened up new areas, wrote about them, and provided the raw information that the European countries needed to exploit these areas as colonies.
In late 19th century Europe, models for undaunted courage were heroic explorers like Henry Morton Stanley. While searching for the source of the Nile, Stanley watched most of his companions die of fever and warfare with hostile peoples. Stanley lost 60 pounds, and his hair turned white. "We have wept so often, we can weep no more," he wrote. But there was one more blow ahead. In his absence, his fiancée had married another man. For late 19th century explorers, it was all in a day's work. What they lost at home, they hoped to doubly gain abroad, as the front-line troops of a new surge of colonialism. The revolution in manufacturing that would transform Europe was fueled in part by adventurism abroad. Great Britain, France, and Germany had developed huge appetites for raw materials and markets for their products. This set off a land grab for Asia and Africa, where minerals, farmland, even labor could be taken by force.
They also wanted to bring European culture to the peoples of these regions. It was a sort of cultural imperialism. They wanted to, in a sense, bring what they considered the best culture in the world to people who they thought had inferior cultures.
These allegedly inferior cultures weren't always happy to see the Europeans. Explorers also had to battle disease, madness, and starvation. Some were military men who brought much-needed professionalism to the trade. Others were doomed amateurs brimming with enthusiasm. Henri Mouhot would take his place among these. Mouhot decided to devote his life to studying new species of flora and fauna. It seemed likely he'd combine his passions and become history's first photographer of wildlife. But fate stepped in. He met and married an Englishwoman, Anna Park. She was a relative of one of the great explorers of West Africa, Mungo Park. Perhaps Anna pressed Henri to match Mungo's feats of daring. Or maybe Henri wasn't suited for domestic life. For less than 2 years after they were wed, Mouhot set out for Southeast Asia. Mouhot intended to keep a diary of his adventure while documenting the natural world. But on his quest for facts, he'd encounter a profound mystery, an abandoned city in the jungle, a rival among the greatest creations of man.
Mouhot is really interesting to me because he went there without a clearly defined program. He also went there on his own funding. In a sense, he took a real chance, but there was just this wanderlust, this chance to open up a new area to the rest of the world. And he, in a sense, seized the moment.
After pausing in Singapore and Pak Nam, Mouhot recovered his land legs in Bangkok, famous in Europe as the Venice of the East. At Bangkok's royal palace, the Frenchman dined with Siam's monk-turned-monarch, King Mongkut. The cultured king grilled Mouhot for news of Europe. He'd become an expert in foreign affairs in order to defend his nation. While countries around Siam fell to European powers, Mongkut would sign trade treaties with many of them, knowing that this would discourage any one from invading his kingdom. To teach English to his children, he'd hired the tutor Anna Leonowens. Her memoirs would inspire the musical The King and I. Its clownish portrait of Mongkut would become the modern world's sole impression of a ruler who almost single-handedly saved Siam from colonization. Mongkut's gifts were all but lost on Mouhot as well. Barely acquainted with Asia, he was distracted by its peculiar customs.
Every inferior crouches before a higher in rank. He receives his orders with abject submission and respect. The whole of society is in a state of prostration.
Despite such attacks on his sensibilities, Muo relished his journeys by boat and even elephant through the uncharted regions of Siam and in time to the frontier of Cambodia. He was warmly received by lesser kings and met with enthusiastic curiosity by all those unaccustomed to having a Farang or white man parade into their midst. Muo wasted little time on making friends. His goal was science.
When Muo traveled throughout Southeast Asia, he employed several helpers who went with him. Muo became very attached to one particular manservant called Fry. He even helped him with some of his collecting. He was a guide, he was an interpreter, he set up the camp. Fry started out as a servant of Muo, but became his comrade and his constant companion. In fact, we owe to Fry our very knowledge of the expeditions of Muo.
On his expeditions, Muo kept meticulous records of plants and animals and made charts of rivers and mountains unheard of in Europe. He cataloged the peoples he encountered, noting differences in their looks and customs. He turned himself into a one-man research team. And in the tradition of great explorers before him, he suffered.
Insects are in great numbers. Several of my books and maps have been almost devoured in one night. We suffered terribly from mosquitoes and had to keep up the incessant fanning to drive off these pestilent little vampires. There is a small species of leech. You have to be constantly pulling them off you by the dozens, but you are sure to return home covered in blood. Scorpions, centipedes, and above all, serpents were the enemies we most dreaded.
Once more in boats, the Frenchman and his companions journeyed north. Their destination, the rumored lost city of Angkor, which interested Muo less than the rare birds he hoped to collect there. On the way, they paused at a lonely wilderness outpost, a Catholic mission run by a French priest. Years of isolation and dysentery had soured the priest's view of the tropics and made him gloomy about Muo's final push to the lost city.
Do you know where you're going? The rains have begun. You're going to almost certain death, or will at least catch a fever, which will be followed by years of languor and suffering. May God be with the poor traveler.
Muo said he'd abide by God's will, but was going nonetheless. After another leg of his river journey, he reached a landmark he knew only from legend, the Ton La Sap Lake, and marveled as the shorelines grew apart by some 5 miles. By now, it had been more than a year since Muo had dined in Bangkok's royal palace. Rough travel had left him ill-prepared for what he was about to see, a vision few Europeans had shared. The lost city of Angkor was not a rumor, but overwhelmingly real.
There are ruins of such grandeur, remains of structures which must have been raised at such an immense cost of labor, that at the first view one is filled with profound admiration and cannot but ask what has become of this powerful race. So civilized, so enlightened, the authors of these gigantic works.
He came looking for insects, came looking for flora and fauna, new species. He didn't come looking for Angkor, but he found it. And I think any of us who may have stumbled on Angkor as he did would have been excited. But whether we could have recorded it in such detail, with such precision as Henri Mouhot did, is unlikely.
One of these temples, a rival to that of Solomon and erected by some ancient Michelangelo, might take an honorable place beside our most beautiful buildings. It's grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome.
The natives enlightened the stunned Mouhot. It's the work of angels, they said. Or giants. It was built by a magician king. It built itself. Mouhot was not an archaeologist, nor an art historian, nor could he read the Sanskrit engravings that adorned the monuments of Angkor. Yet he was an illustrator. With his customary zeal, he set out to sketch the most magnificent of the lost city's some 1,000 temples and describe them inch by inch.
The west side of the gallery is supported by 2 rows of square columns. On the east, blank windows have been let into the wall, with balconies of twisted columns 14 centimeters in diameter. In the center of the causeway are 2 elegant pavilions, having at each extremity a portico 33 meters 66 centimeters in length.
Mouhot was a very keen observer. He was a collector of information. He had this natural history background to describe things in a very careful way. So when he found the monuments at Angkor, he went ahead and approached them in the same way he would approach his zoological specimens, with careful description.
The vaulted ceilings of the galleries are raised 6 meters from the ground. Those of the second roof are 4 meters 30 centimeters high. The bas-reliefs represent combat and procession. Fabulous animals are busy devouring some. Others are in irons and have had their eyes put out.
He could tell that it was the results of an ancient civilization that had flourished in this area. He could also tell by the inscriptions in many of the monuments. They were mostly in Sanskrit or Old Khmer. He could tell by these inscriptions, even though he couldn't read them, that these were a very learned people who had built all this, and yet they were gone without a trace.
Sad frailty of human things. How many centuries and thousands of generations have passed away, of which history will never tell us anything? What treasures of art will remain forever buried beneath these ruins? How many distinguished artists, kings, and warriors are now forgotten?
Mouhot was deeply frustrated by the mystery of who had created the city of Angkor. He noted the similarity between the faces and the carvings and the people living in the surrounding forests. But he couldn't bring himself to believe that these Cambodians were descended from Angkor's peerless artists. In fact, the artistry of Cambodia had never died. Though it never again reached the heights of Angkor, Khmer art flourished throughout Southeast Asia. Demand for replicas of its most famous works grows with Angkor's fame. Oblivious of Cambodia's past, Mouhot saw France in its future. Only a full-scale takeover, he concluded, could correct the nation's deplorable condition. The sooner, the better.
European conquest, wise and protecting laws, and experience would alone effect the regeneration of the state. I wish France to possess this land, which would add a magnificent jewel to her crown.
Though Muo wouldn't live to see it, France did intervene soon after his expedition, making Cambodia a protectorate in 1864. It would last nearly a century. Muo's diary wasn't the cause, but like explorers' tales before, it fueled interest and imitation. King Mongkut's tutor, Anna Leonowens, was so moved by Muo's description of Angkor, she'd later copy it for her own book.
Angkor was never a lost city in Asians' eyes. They knew about it. And from the 16th century onward, Jesuit priests wrote it in their diaries. It's just that their diaries were so confidential it didn't reach a wide public.
Muo was the first person to popularize Angkor. And it was his sketches, his descriptions, that really is why he was credited with the discovery of Angkor.
With a saber in one hand, Fry pursues the fishes in the stream. He and his shadow, reflected on the rocks and water, might easily be mistaken by the natives for demons. It is pleasant to the man devoted to our good and beautiful Mother Nature to think that his work, his fatigues, his troubles and dangers are useful to others. I doubt not others will follow in my steps and gather an abundant harvest where I have but cleared the ground.
Muo had been traveling for the better part of 3 years. The amateur enthusiast had become an expert naturalist, a skilled outdoorsman, a hardened explorer. He treated Fry and his other servants as his family, whom he alternately nursed and scolded, and with whom he shed tears at parting. Yet even as his letters home turned wistful and sentimental, and his journey stretched from 2 years to 3, he couldn't seem to turn back. Only on the trail was he at peace.
Do not be anxious when you think of your poor friend the traveler, for you know that up to the present time, everything has prospered with him. I experience a degree of contentment, strength of soul, and internal peace, which I have never known before.
But the French priest's dire warning finally came true. The weather and mosquitoes were the worst yet. First Fry fell sick.
For 5 days, we were compelled to remain in the forest. It rained a great part of the day. The torrents overflowed. I never in my life passed such wretched nights. My poor Fry was seized with a dreadful fever, and I myself felt very ill.
October 29, 1861. Overcome by fever, the 35-year-old Muo scratched out his last journal entry.
Have pity on me, oh my God.
Fry recovered and gave his master a proper burial. Then he brought Muo's possessions out of the forest and put them on boats for Europe. Most of the zoological samples the naturalist had collected during his journeys had already been lost at sea, but his journal made it safely back to England. Shortly after Henri Muo alerted the world to the wonders of Angkor, the work of recovering its treasures began. Atmuo's meticulous descriptions had inspired Europe to take a closer look. But the questions had only just begun. Who were Angkor's builders, the empire called the Khmer? What were their lives like? Archaeologists had no written record to go on. If the Khmer had chronicled their story, they probably did so on palm leaves and paper. Time had turned the perishable history to dust. With nothing known about their builders, Angkor's monuments seemed destined to hold their tongues forever. Then, in 1902, a remarkable document came to light, and a most unlikely voice reverberated across 8 centuries. The fantastic civilization of the Khmer, thought to be forever beyond reach, came to life in all its grandeur. In about 10,000 words, this report captured the heart of the lost kingdom of Angkor. Its author was a diplomat sent to Cambodia by China's fearsome Mongol dynasty. The Mongols are famous for their deadly mounted warriors and for tactics that routed European armies. At the end of the 13th century, however, they took aim at Southeast Asia. In 1286, the Mongols struck deep into what's now Vietnam. A year later, the capital of Burma fell to the hordes. Yet the infamous horsemen didn't like fighting in the alien jungle terrain. Perhaps this alone saved Angkor from being next. Instead, Mongol Emperor Timur Khan gave orders for diplomats to go to Angkor and collect tribute from the Cambodian king. This would appease the Khan while allowing the envoys to size up Angkor for possible future attack. One of these diplomats was Chao Tequan.
Chao Tequan, in his writing, never said why he was there. He was part of an embassy, which obviously meant that it was him trying to check out on trade, get intelligence on what this kingdom was like, to show to the Mongol emperor what sorts of people lay at the far boundaries of his empire, what sorts of products they had, what they looked like.
The inhabitants are rude and ugly and very black. The indigenous women are very lustful. If a husband has to leave for a distant mission, that's all right for a couple of nights. But after a dozen nights, the woman will certainly complain. Who am I, a ghost that needs no one to sleep with?
He was a keen observer, telling us about the people, the daily lives. Chao Tequan left us something very special. He has left the only first-hand record that we have of Angkor. He was here when Angkor was a kingdom. But we have to always keep in mind he was a foreigner, so he was perceiving the kingdom in what he knew in his background, which was Chinese.
About Chao Tequan, little is known. He was probably about 30 years old, a diplomat, perhaps an aristocrat. From the details he reported to the Khan emerged a character fascinated with earthly pleasures.
He came from an obsessive, prudish kind of culture, and he saw in his tropical climate and enjoyed seeing women taking off their scanty costumes and getting into the river to bathe with nothing on at all. And he commented on this not only because it was so barbarian and rare and un-Chinese, but I think also because he enjoyed watching this the spectacle.
Every 3 or 4 days, the women go and bathe in a river outside the city. Even the women from the noble families take part in these baths and aren't ashamed. Everyone can see them from the top of their heads to the bottom of their feet. The Chinese, on their day off, go and see it. I've heard that there are those who enter the water to take advantage of the situation. The water is always as hot as fire.
For Chow Tek-wan, his year in Angkor would be full of such surprises and contrasts. He was Chinese, but from the frigid plains, a Mongol whose culture worshipped war above all things. By contrast, the Khmer had embraced Buddhism and its creed of compassion and rebirth. The city of 1 million enjoyed a calendar full of parades, festivals, and holy days. Chow Tek-wan was like a fox in a strange and magnificent henhouse.
When Chow Tek-wan arrived in 1296, I think he was quite surprised, being a kind of a Chinese chauvinist. I think he expected to find barbarians. He found a city thriving, prosperous, heavily populated. People seem, as far as he could tell, quite happy.
The Chinese who arrive as sailors find it comfortable that in this country one doesn't have to wear clothes. And since rice is easy to earn and women easy to persuade, there are many who desert to stay.
As he catalogued Angkor's marvels, Chow Tek-wan himself may have thought about deserting for a life in the jungle paradise. No doubt he soon discovered that all the Khmer's might and majesty largely depended on one thing: water. Three rice harvests a year fed the city of about 1 million and paid for everything from temple building to defense. To grow the rice, they had to tame the water.
They harnessed the water from the Tonle Sap Lake by building a series of canals, dikes, and moats from the lake up to the city of Angkor. And during the rainy season, when the lake began to rise, water was forced up these canals, up above the city, and collected in large reservoirs called barrays for year-round use. And in fact, the system that was employed in Angkor 1,000 years ago is more advanced than any irrigation system used in Cambodia today.
The relationship between the king and water has a very long history. The whole reason that Angkor is located on this plain is because of the access of water. So the king could provide fish and rice, and therefore his people would prosper and his genealogy would continue.
Not surprisingly, the symbol of water, a snake, is key to Khmer faith. In Angkor, Chow Tek-wan would have found the revered reptile depicted countless times in scenes said to reveal the secret of immortality.
The churning of the ocean of milk is known in Hindu mythology. It's much loved in Cambodia in their art, and it's depicted with gods on one side and demons on the other, and they're holding the large, scaly body of a serpent. They pull left and right in a way that we would call a tug of war. They're churning to try to yield the elixir of immortality.
Immortality was a daily pursuit within the royal palace, the abode of Khmer kings. Kings had more than 1,000 concubines, the most beautiful women of the empire. Scores are depicted at the royal terrace, no two alike.
Concerning the concubines and the girls of the palace, I've heard that the number is between 3,000 and 5,000. When in a family there's a beautiful girl, she's immediately sent to the palace.
As a foreigner and an oddity, Chow Tek-wan wasn't permitted to enter the royal palace, but he heard a legend about the magic that took place inside.
In the Golden Tower inside the palace, the sovereign goes to sleep in its highest part. All the locals assert that inside the tower there is a genie, master of the whole territory of the kingdom. This genie appears every night in the form of a woman. It's with her that the sovereign lies and then has sex. If one night the genie doesn't appear, this is because the time for the barbarian king's death has come. If the king doesn't show up even for one night, something terrible will happen.
He would comment on some of their unusual customs, but then he would always draw comparisons back to the way we do things in China. So I think he saw commonalities between the Khmer and the Chinese.
In this country, it's the women who know about commerce. If a Chinese arrives here and immediately takes a woman, it's because he wants to take advantage of the woman's trading skills, which could easily exceed his own.
Chao Tequan disapproved of most Angkor customs, but praised one, the status of women. The envoy noted that women ran commerce throughout the city, and women intellectuals were among the king's most trusted counselors. Women figure prominently in engravings on a temple at Angkor called the Bayon. They depict dozens of types of business and the daily activities of Khmer life. In fact, everything the Mongols wanted to know about the Khmer was right here. Agriculture, slaves, rare goods. For Chao Tequan, it would have been an intelligence gold mine.
Valuable products are the feathers of the kingfisher, elephant tusks, rhino's horn, and beeswax. The white rhinoceros horn is veined and is the most precious. The black one is inferior. In general, the people of this country are very simple. When they see a Chinese, they are respectfully frightened and call him Buddha. Seeing him, they throw themselves to the ground and bow low.
From Chao Tequan's reports, we know about the fact that there were astronomers there. We know about the fact that various groups of people within the court were scientists. So this was an area of discovery. This was the Renaissance area of Southeast Asia.
More than 5 centuries before Europe's Renaissance, Cambodian Michelangelos sent their masterpieces soaring skyward. Reliefs at the Bayon acknowledged the builders, but one monument at Angkor made them immortal. The Chinese envoy, Chao Tequan, was probably barred from Angkor's greatest marvel, a funerary temple built for a king. He skipped over it in his report, mentioning only that a Chinese artisan had probably built it. No doubt the envoy coveted the Khmer's timeless masterpiece, Angkor Wat. Over a century before Chao Tequan arrived, the last stone was fitted into place. Archaeologists have determined that it took almost 30 years to complete and was finished in time to bury the king.
Some historians believe that Angkor Wat is a funerary temple. The main basis for this is that the entrance is at the west. In Hindu mythology, this signifies death. When you enter, you feel that you are moving from the world of man to the world of the deities.
According to tradition, priests placed the king's ashes inside the temple he built for himself. Yet the monarch didn't dwell in the next world alone. Attending him are 1,700 enchanted beings called apsaras.
The apsaras are the celestial nymphs, the beautiful women that fly through the heavens and dance for the gods. And they stand ready, dressed in their jewelry and their beautiful costumes, to do whatever the gods would need to make them happy and for the kingdom to prosper. These celestial nymphs were born simply to please the gods. Can you imagine it?
Angkor Wat had hardly claimed its place on the horizon when disaster struck. Drawn by its increasing splendor, the Chams from what's now Vietnam attacked and burned the city. Countless inhabitants were killed or forced into exile. By the time the capital was rebuilt, a sea change had taken place. His people had suffered, so the king built a walled city, Angkor Thom, to protect them in time of war. Like their king, most of the Khmer people abandoned Hinduism and followed in the Buddha's path. Zhao Tequan was familiar with Buddhism, a popular religion in China, but he was awed by its Cambodian face.
Above each gate of the enclosure, there are 5 big Buddha heads carved in stone. Their faces turned towards the 4 cardinal points. At the center is placed one of these heads, but this one is decorated in gold.
It's a kind face. It's a god of compassion and wisdom. This art feature had never before been seen at Angkor, and in fact, there's not even a prototype known. Some say that it represents the king, looking in all directions, north, south, east, and west, and that makes him the ruler of the universe.
Every day, the king holds audiences for affairs of state. The king, sword in hand, appears in the golden window. All present join their hands and touch the earth with their foreheads. It is plain to see that these people, though barbarians, know what is due to a prince.
Zhao Tequan arrived in Angkor when its king had undisputed control over an empire of seemingly limitless potential. Despite his glowing account, his master Timur Khan never plundered the nation's treasures. Perhaps Cambodia's climate was too similar to that of Vietnam, where the Mongols had tasted rare defeat. Or perhaps the Khmer seemed too strong to tame.
Zhou Daquan may have painted too fine a portrait for invasion. Maybe Timur decided it really wasn't worth invading. And maybe there were plans, but later other things happened in the Middle Kingdom that, in a sense, blocked any future expansion.
Yet the Khmer's story would soon come to an end, whether the Mongol Khan invaded or not. Archaeologists and historians have pieced together the final chapter. By Zhao Tequan's time, 22 kings over 500 years had worked the land until it began to fail. Rice harvests dropped, and stone monument building ceased. Maintenance of the reservoirs and canals suffered. The king's sacred covenant with the water was broken. Early in the 15th century, the Kingdom of Siam made profitable raids into Khmer territory. A climactic battle in 1431 brought about the end. All but abandoned, the Khmer capital was lulled into a century encroaching jungle. Fortunately, Chao Tequan had long since carried his chronicle to safety. Angkor had won the envoy's respect, and he repaid it with the only surviving portrait of Cambodia's ancient treasures.
Coming to Angkor for most people is a bit of a pilgrimage to a sacred place. Somehow it just touches your soul.
Every time you see it looming out of the forest, it hits you very, very hard. And the mystery is that it doesn't explain itself.
We don't know much except from reports of Zhou Daquan of how they lived. Yet, we can still see the monuments they left, and we can speculate and we can dream about the greatness of this civilization.